It came as a shock to everyone. The Germans were invading the Soviet Union, and they would be in the palace town of Leningrad within days. And so a young curator named Anatoly Kuchumov had to quickly figure out how to make an entire room disappear. You might think this would be an easy task. Why don't you just pack everything up and ship it somewhere safe? Sure, if what you needed to hide were the objects in the room. What Kuchumov needed to hide was the room itself. A room made entirely of amber. Not a few amber accents, but panels and panels of intricately worked fossilized tree resin. It was the pride of Russia, referred to when it reached its final state as the eighth wonder of the world. Many places have vied for that title, but the Amber Room truly held a claim on it. The Amber Room lived inside the Catherine Palace, where the rest of its treasures were being packed up and loaded onto trains headed east. But there was a problem with the Amber Room. The thing that made it so special had become hard and brittle over the years. Tree resin doesn't exactly respond well to hundreds of years of smoke and heat from burning candles, or from fewer but no less potent years of the dry warmth of indoor heating. Kuchumov attempted to pry a panel from the wall, and it immediately began to shatter in his hands. So he pivoted. If he couldn't take the Amber Room somewhere safe, the next best thing was to hide it. He covered the walls in gauze and cotton and muslin, creating a kind of makeshift wallpaper to make the room look utterly plain. Just another empty room. Having done the best he could without rest for days, Kuchumov and his wife then boarded a train east to act as stewards of the rest of the collection. In his bag were 28 small pieces of amber that had already broken off the walls, a reminder of the thing that was the most valuable to him, that he at this point could only hope he had done enough to save. This is a story about a lost thing, and why so many refuse to accept its most likely fate. To understand why Kuchumov spent the rest of his life on this room, and why decades after his death, strangers are still diving into the Baltic Sea to look for it, you have to start with what he was standing in front of. So we go back, past the war, past Russia, to a cold court on the edge of Europe, and a king who wanted something no one had made before. I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. To the modern mind, amber seems, if not incredibly ordinary, then hardly something valuable enough to deem a room of it the eighth wonder of the world. And it is, at its core, just tree sap that leaked out of pine or fir trees, hardened, then let the forces of nature carry it under the soil or the sea, where for millions of years, the pressure and the heat of these deep, dark places squeezed any last remaining bits of liquid and gas, until all you're left with is beautiful honey-like amber. The richest deposit on Earth sits under the Baltic, off a stretch of coast that was then called Samland, and for most of history, the way you got it was to wait for a storm to tear it loose from the seabed and wade out into freezing water to scoop it up in nets. They called it the gold of the North, and they meant that literally. When our story begins, amber was worth about 12 times its weight in gold. The idea of a room made of it came from Prussia, at a very particular moment of Prussian ambition. In January of 1701, in the castle at Königsberg, a man named Frederick crowned himself the first king in Prussia. Prussia was a cold, scattered, upstart kingdom trying to talk its way into the top tier of European royalty, and a new king, with something to prove, needs to look the part. So when his court sculptor, Andreas Schluter, proposed lining a room in Berlin's Charlottenburg Palace with carved amber, at a scale no one had ever attempted, it was less a decorating choice than a flex. Anyone could gild a room in gold. Only Prussia, sitting on the world's largest supply, could spend the gold of the North by the ton. The problem was that almost nobody knew how to work amber that way, because nobody had needed to. Schluter brought in a master carver named Gottfried Wolfram, on loan from the Danish court, and the two of them more or less invented the craft as they went. They heated the amber until it softened, then tinted it in baths of honey and linseed to deepen the color, and fixed the thin worked pieces onto wooden panels backed in gold and silver so that they would glow instead of just sit there. It was slow and it was fragile, and it was nowhere near finished when the tides shifted. Political events shifted the leadership on the building of the Amber Room, slowing down the process. And then Frederick I died in 1713. When he did, his son Frederick William, a soldier and famously a tightwad, looked at his father's glittering half-built monument and saw nothing but a massive amount of money that could be spent elsewhere. So the unfinished panels were crated up and confined to the cellars. With this history in mind, the Amber Room was originally a pre-German German invention. But the Amber Room we know, the Amber Room we still search for, didn't exist yet. It was still waiting for Russia. Because then, in 1716, in a somewhat comedic turn of events, that thrifty soldier king, Frederick William I, met with the Russian Tsar, Peter the Great, to seal an alliance between their countries. Peter had seen the amber panels years earlier and never forgot them. Frederick William, who continued to not care about the thing at all, saw a chance to rid himself of a huge financial burden. So he gave Peter the Amber Room. Yes, gave. You'll sometimes hear this gift referred to as a peace treaty, but it wasn't quite that formal. It was more like a diplomatic gift meant to further cement an alliance between two rulers who needed each other. So the Russian Amber Room enters Russian history as a gift of friendship from the soon-to-be Germans, saying, hey, we're a team. A gesture is one thing. Getting crates of fragile amber from Berlin to St. Petersburg is another. The whole endeavor took 6 months of careful, slow travel, avoiding as many potholes as possible. But they finally arrived. Intact in terms of panels, but hardly intact in terms of a standing room. And Frederick William had neglected to provide Peter with any instruction on how to put the things together. Nor did anyone in all of Russia have the very specialized skill set to be able to figure it out. So for 20 years, it sat in storage, now just in a different country. Peter the Great died in 1725, never having realized his utmost desire of putting together the Amber Room. But eventually, Russia did the thing the Prussians never got the chance to do. It finished the room and then took it even further. Peter's daughter, the Empress Elizabeth, pulled the Amber Room out of storage and handed it to her favorite architect, an Italian named Rastrelli, with one instruction that would define the room forever: make it bigger. The Prussian panels came nowhere near covering the grand hall she had in mind, so Rastrelli spread them across the walls and filled the gaps with tall, gilded mirrors until the amber and the reflections ran together, and the room felt twice as deep as it was. In 1755, it went where it would stay, the Catherine Palace, in the summer town outside St. Petersburg. Then Catherine the Great got hold of it, and Catherine did not do things by halves. She ordered close to 1,000 pounds of fresh amber shipped up from the Baltic, brought in master carvers, and had them replace the improvised sections with the real thing. She also commissioned 4 mosaic panels of Florentine stone representing the senses. By the time her craftsmen finished in the 1770s, the amber room was not a Prussian object that had happened to live in Russia. It had been enlarged, refilled, recarved, and maintained by Russian hands and Russian money for decades, and it would stay that way for a century and a half more. So the Germans planted the seed, but the Russians grew the tree. And by the 20th century, the Amber Room was the most popular site in the imperial palaces, admired in spite of Russia's vast attempts to wipe away all traces of their former czars. Which brings us back to a 29-year-old curator in September of 1941, watching the first panel crack in his hands. The invasion that Kuchumov was racing against came on June 22, 1941, and the scene it created inside the palaces was one of utter chaos. There were millions of objects across these imperial estates and a handful of curators to deal with them, and there was no time to do it properly. They ran out of crates. They ran out of packing straw. Toward the end, they were wrapping priceless things in the old dress trunks of dead empresses and whatever hay they could find, and working until they got nosebleeds from bending over the boxes. And the hardest object in the entire collection landed with Kuchumov. But who exactly was Anatoly Kuchumov? He was, as we said, 29 years old. He was not an aristocrat or an academic from an old family. He was the son of a carpenter, a peasant kid with no money and no connections who had talked his way into a junior clerk's job at the palaces and then climbed, fast, until he was the chief curator of one of them, all before he turned 30. He was a young man who had gotten everything he had by being careful and capable and not making mistakes. And the longer you go without making a mistake, the more likely it is that when you finally do, it's a big one. Now, we already know what he decided because that's where we started. He couldn't move the amber without shattering it, so he hid it where it stood, behind a false wall of gauze and cotton and muslin, and left to look after the rest of the collection. Kuchumov's caution was understandable and well-intentioned. Everything he knew about this room told him that moving it would destroy it, and he was right about that. He was trying to solve a genuinely hard problem that not everyone who came after him would care about. And that care, that refusal to damage the thing he loved, is exactly what allowed for everything that came next. Because the Germans were not confused for long. When their troops reached the Catherine Palace, it took them almost no time to work out that the plain papered-over room was not what it pretended to be. Soldiers began tearing at the coverings, and then the machinery of Nazi art looting, which was vast and organized and staffed by actual scholars, moved in to claim the prize. The people who came for the Amber Room knew exactly what it was, and they took it apart with staggering efficiency. By the Germans' own account, a single officer and 6 men stripped the entire room off the walls in about 36 hours. Kuchumov had looked at this room and seen something so fragile it could not survive being touched. The Germans looked at the same room and simply took it in a day and a half because to them, a cracked panel was not a tragedy. It was acceptable losses. The thing that had been too delicate for the man who wanted to save it turned out to be perfectly movable for the men who only wanted to own it. It reached its destination already damaged, with pieces broken and missing, but it reached it. That destination was Königsberg, the old Prussian capital, the same city where a king had crowned himself 240 years earlier and set this whole thing in motion. And this is where one of the threads we planted at the beginning pulls tight. The Amber Room had come to Russia as a gift, an offering of friendship between two countries. It left Russia as plunder, hauled west by an invading army. Given as a gesture of peace, taken as an act of war. The Nazis did not see it as theft, of course. They told themselves a different story, which was that they were bringing German art home. In their telling, the Amber Room was a Prussian masterpiece that had spent 2 centuries in Russian captivity, and they were simply repatriating it. You can see the appeal of that story, and you can also see by now exactly what is wrong with it. The room they carried into Königsberg was overwhelmingly a Russian creation, enlarged and refilled and recarved by Russian hands, and it had been given to Russia freely by the Germans' own ancestors. But a good enough story does not need to be true to be useful. And this one was very useful. The man who received the room in Königsberg was named Alfred Rode, and he was the director of the collections at Königsberg Castle. Rode was an amber specialist. He had written a book about it. He was, by every account, genuinely and almost helplessly in love with the Amber Room, and having it delivered into his care was probably the great event of his professional life. He installed it in the castle, put it on display, and for 2 years he tended it with real devotion. Rode is a fascinating character because he does not sort cleanly into villain or victim. He was a functionary of a regime committing the largest campaign of art theft in human history, and the room he was lovingly polishing had been ripped off the walls of an invaded country. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels the other. The room went on display in the castle, and the setting had a grim joke built into it. Königsberg Castle was a medieval fortress, and its lower levels held a restaurant known in German as the Blood Court, named because it sat in what had once been the castle's torture chamber. So the 8th wonder of the world, the honey-colored miracle that a whole country had traveled to see, spent its last documented years on display directly above a dungeon. For a while, it simply stayed there, admired by German visitors, cared for by Rode. If the war had gone differently, that might be the end of the story, with the room sitting in a German museum and an argument raging to this day about who ought to get it back. But the war did not go differently. By 1944, it was going very badly for Germany, and the fighting was coming for Königsberg in a way it had once come for Leningrad. In August of 1944, British bombers hit the city, and parts of the castle burned. The Amber Room, by most accounts, survived that raid, and Rode wrote letters afterward describing his efforts to keep it safe, to crate it up, to find somewhere the fighting couldn't reach it. You can hear the strain in them. The man who had been given something he truly loved was now watching the world close in around it, and he was running out of options and out of time. Those letters are some of the last solid documentation anyone has of the Amber Room's whereabouts. After them, the paper trail thins, and then it stops. The last credible sighting we have is that in April of 1945, as the Red Army fought its way into Königsberg, a 19-year-old Soviet lieutenant made his way into the burning castle. As he remembered it decades later, he saw fragments of an amber panel and a mirror frame in the Great Hall, and a nervous caretaker told him the rest of it was packed into crates down in the basement. The caretaker offered to show him, but the lieutenant, in the middle of a battle, said no and moved on. 2 days later, the whole city was in flames, and he could not have gotten back down to that basement even if he had wanted to. Königsberg fell to the Soviets on April 9th, 1945. And then the Amber Room, the thing a young curator had risked everything to hide, the thing a German curator had loved past all reason, was simply gone. Nobody has seen it since. The first person the Soviet government sent to find the Amber Room found an answer almost right away. The problem was that his answer was the one nobody wanted to hear. His name was Alexander Brusov, an archaeologist from a museum in Moscow, and in May of 1945, weeks after the city fell, he was sent into the ruins of Königsberg to recover the room. The conditions were miserable. The castle was a burned-out shell full of collapsing rubble. He had almost no help, and the few local Germans who offered to point him toward hidden art had a way of turning up dead. But he dug anyway. And in the wreckage of the Great Hall, the same hall where a young lieutenant had glimpsed those amber fragments a month earlier, he found what was left of it. Charred remains of the stone mosaics, burned door hinges, the iron strips that had bound the crates. He put it all together and reached the obvious conclusion. The Amber Room had been in this hall, in its crates, and it had burned when the hall burned. He wrote it down plainly. They should stop looking for the Amber Room because there was nothing left to find. He may not have found the intact Amber Room, but Brusov did find a person who could be of some help. Alfred Rhoda was still alive in the ruins of the castle, still hovering around the collection he had loved. Brusov questioned him. Rhoda was helpful and evasive at the same time, and at one point Brusov caught him burning papers. And then, that winter, Alfred Rhoda and his wife simply disappeared. No bodies were ever found. No graves, no death records, nothing. The man who had watched over the Amber Room to the end walked out of the story and was never seen again, which did the mystery no favors at all. But for one moment in the summer of 1945, the case was effectively closed. A qualified man had gone to the scene, found the fire and the wreckage, and said, "It's gone." If the story had ended there, there would be no story. Everything that happens for the next 80 years happens because people could not accept what Brusov found. The first person who couldn't accept it was the last person who had touched the room while it was whole. Moscow did not like Brusov's answer, and in 1946, it sent someone back to Königsberg to look again. It sent Anatoly Kuchumov. The curator who had hidden the room in 1941 was a little older now, and he arrived under a cover story, officially just on vacation, and went over the same ground Brusov had covered. And he came back with the opposite conclusion. He pointed out that only 3 of the room's 4 stone mosaics had turned up in the ashes, not all 4. He argued that the burned space was too small to have held the entire room. And he noted that no one had found any melted amber, no trace of the panels themselves. And from this, he concluded that the Amber Room had not burned in that hall at all. It had been moved, hidden somewhere else before the fire, and it was still out there waiting to be found. Some of that was a fair set of questions, but Kuchumov was not a neutral party. He was the man whose careful plan had failed. If the room had burned, then he was, for the rest of his life, the curator who lost it. If the room was only hidden, then he was the man who could still find it. You can understand why someone in that position might look at a pile of ash and see a reason to keep hoping. At this point in 1946, the Amber Room mystery is essentially hinging on the opinion of one man. Without Kuchumov's refusal, Brusov's answer stands and the search is over. He is the engine. But he did not stay the only one for long. A missing Amber Room, it turned out, was useful to people far more powerful than a single curator. In the years after the war, the Soviet Union had a problem of its own, which was that it had also done an enormous amount of looting. As the Red Army pushed through Germany, it stripped the country of art on a staggering scale, hundreds of thousands of works, much of which quietly disappeared into Soviet storerooms where it would sit unacknowledged for decades. At the same time, the Soviets were standing at the Nuremberg trials pointing correctly at everything the Nazis had destroyed, including the wrecked palaces around Leningrad. It is an awkward thing to be both the victim of art theft and one of its largest practitioners at the same time. So a still missing Amber Room fit neatly on the useful side of that ledger. As long as the room was stolen by Nazis and hidden who knew where, it was a permanent open wound, proof of German barbarism, a treasure the fascists had taken from the Russian people and never given back. As a pile of ash in a Soviet-held city, possibly burned in the chaos of a Soviet assault, it was worth nothing, or worse than nothing. So the version where the room survived, the version Kuchumov needed for his own private reasons, was also the version the state preferred. Brusov was pushed to walk his conclusion back, and he did. Years later, when the search became public, a set of newspaper articles laid out the official story of the hunt and painted the archaeologist who first examined the ruins as a bungler who had jumped to conclusions. Those articles ran under an ordinary journalist's name, but that name was a cover. They had actually been written by a senior local party official. The man who first looked for the Amber Room was quietly recast as the man who had given up on it too easily, and the record was adjusted to match. And underneath all of this, Kuchumov kept searching. It was still his obsession, still his life's work. But it was no longer only his. The thing he had started for private reasons had become useful to the state. And when something becomes useful to an entire country, it grows to enormous proportions. Then the mystery crossed a border and picked up a second government. By the 1950s, the search had spread to East Germany, and over the following decades, it grew into something remarkable. The East German secret police, the Stasi, took up the hunt. A researcher named Paul Encke made it his defining project, working partly under a false name, and in time, the effort had its own official code name and a budget to match. They dug, they chased leads across the country, they collected testimony from anyone who claimed to know anything. And those public appeals for eyewitnesses were not only about finding the room. When a government asks its population to write in with everything they remember about a secret wartime operation, it learns a great deal about who knows what, whether or not it ever finds the treasure. The method was borrowed more or less from wartime propaganda. You put out a story that is mostly true, you hide the fact that the state is the one asking, and you watch who comes forward. More than 1,000 people wrote in. And then it slipped loose of governments altogether and got into private hands, where the reins really got loose. The clearest case is a German man named Georg Stein. Stein was not a spy or a scholar. He was a former farmer, a grower of strawberries, who became consumed by the search and gave the last decades of his life to it. He had real successes early on. He helped return other art that had been looted during the war, and he was honored for it. But the Amber Room got into him. He chased it obsessively, and what he did not know was that some of the leads driving him had been fed to him deliberately by the Stasi through that same researcher operating under his false name, while the money that kept him going came from a wealthy emigre in the West. Stein was being steered from one direction and funded from another, chasing a room that the people steering him may well have known was ash. In 1987, Georg Stein was found dead in a Bavarian forest, his body cut open. The story that went around the world was that he had been murdered, silenced, killed to protect the secret of the Amber Room. It was a perfect ending for a treasure legend, the obsessive who got too close and was eliminated. It was also probably not true. The most careful account of his death concludes that Stein killed himself, and that certain earlier episodes reported as violent attacks by masked strangers had in fact been staged. It was a genuine tragedy, a man destroyed from the inside by an obsession that other people were feeding for their own ends. But a tragedy is quieter than a murder. To this day, you can find his death told in reputable places as an assassination. When the true version is sad and the false version is thrilling, the false version tends to win. Kuchumov never met Georg Stein. He never met most of the people who by the end were staking their savings and their reputations and sometimes their lives on the idea he had put out into the world. By now, the Amber Room did not need Kuchumov, or the Soviet state, or the Stasi, or any single obsessive. It had reached the stage every good legend eventually reaches, where the story keeps itself alive. Ask where the Amber Room is today, and you will get a dozen answers. And the interesting thing is that each one belongs to a different kind of searcher. There's the romantic, tragic version, which says the room was loaded onto a ship in the last winter of the war and went down with it. That ship was the Wilhelm Gustloff, a German liner torpedoed by a Soviet submarine in January of 1945 while it was crammed with refugees fleeing the Red Army. Something like 9,000 people died, most of them civilians, many of them children, which makes it one of the worst maritime disasters that has ever happened. It's easy to see why the Amber Room got attached to it. If you want a resting place worthy of a lost wonder, a frozen mass grave at the bottom of the Baltic will certainly do. There is the gotcha version, in which the Amber Room never actually left Russia at all. The story goes that Stalin had copies of the Amber Room made and preemptively hid the real one before replacing it in the Catherine Palace with one of these fake versions. So the room the Nazis came into possession of was never the quote-unquote real Amber Room to begin with, but a modern-day replica. Some versions of this story claim Stalin sold the real Amber Room to American magnate Armand Hammer, yes, of Army-Hammer relation, and then had it returned. Some say that it stayed hidden in Russia somewhere, and the replica that took decades and millions of dollars to rebuild and install inside the Catherine Palace, the one you can actually go and see today, is actually the real Amber Room, safe and sound where it always should have been. Then there is the amateur treasure hunter version, which tends to happen on land, in mines, and tends to come with rivals. For years, hobbyist hunters have been convinced the room is hidden in a sealed mine shaft somewhere in the mountains along the German-Czech border. the old mining country of the Ore Mountains. In the early 2000s, one German treasure hunter chased a tip he said came from former SS officers and started digging on one side of the border, while on the other side, the mayor of a small German town led his own dig toward what he was sure was the same hidden chamber. 2 teams, 2 countries, racing toward a treasure that neither of them found. Every few years, this version returns in a new location. A bunker complex in northeastern Poland, where museum staff reported a ground radar anomaly, a hidden room, and an old account of trucks unloading something heavy in the winter of 1944. There's versions where it's in a cave or a bricked-up cellar. The specifics change, but the certainty never does. And the searches have not stopped. In 2020, a team of Polish divers located the wreck of a German steamer called the Karlsruhe on the floor of the Baltic. The Karlsruhe had genuinely fled Königsberg in the last days of the war, heavily loaded, before it was sunk, and when the divers found crates in the wreck, the old question lit up all over again. Was this finally it? It was not. But the point is not whether they found the amber room. The point is that in 2020, 3/4 of a century after Brusov stood in the ashes and said to stop looking, people put on dive gear and went down in the dark to look anyway. The Soviet state that found the missing room useful is gone. The Stasi is gone. Kuchumov is gone. And still the searching goes on because the story has become the kind of thing that gets handed from person to person, retold on television and online, thrown in front of new audiences who fall for it exactly the way everyone before them did. The room has almost stopped being the point. The mystery itself is the valuable object now. Anatoly Kuchumov died in 1993. A few years before that, an old man by then, he published a book about the Amber Room. He had spent nearly 50 years on it. He had never found it. And he ended the book by insisting in print that the Amber Room had not died. But by the time he wrote those words, the search no longer depended on his belief or on anyone's, really. He had wanted more than anything for the room to still be out there, immortal and waiting. And in a way, he got his wish, just not in the shape he wanted. So where does that leave the actual amber, the real thing a young man once hid behind a false wall and hoped to save? If you were to ask me what happened, I'm inclined to side with Bursov. The Amber Room was destroyed during the bombing of Königsberg. Do I wish it was more romantic or more mysterious than that? Of course, I'm human too. How great would it be to know that Stalin pulled a fast one on the Nazis, or the Czech Republic is keeping it hidden in some basement underneath a castle? And I understand why others want an alternative to be true too. For Russia, it helps them to grow the myth, to refuse to acknowledge their part of the responsibility in destroying it. For Germany, they would get to repent for their sins. For those who had a hand in its disappearance, they can redeem themselves too. And for everyone who searches for the lost Amber Room, they can do so with the possibility of coming out of the whole situation a hero. But knowing what we know about the fragility of amber, about the chaos of both its confiscation and the bombing of Königsberg, I just don't see how it could have made it through. Perhaps somebody, someday, will prove me wrong. After all, the mystery keeps churning. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, if something here surprised you, made you think differently, or just gave you something interesting to talk about over drinks with friends, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or a moment in art history you're curious about, drop a comment below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.